Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Mr. Harvey, aka Your World, has a saying that he likes to repeat. This country was founded by thieves, slaves, and opportunists. We have a lot of people who are opportunists who came to the U.S., then try to use any falsehood or distortion that they can to get as much as they can for themselves of the prosperity that Black Americans made possible. And their favorite method of justifying this opportunism is to make blatantly false comparisons between themselves and us. Everyone tries that because we're the only people with a legitimate claim to have ever been mistreated in this country. Everyone else who came here doesn't have a leg to stand on that front. They chose to come here. And when you make a choice of your own free will, you have to accept the consequences that come along with it. That's called personal responsibility. But in a world ruled by anti-Black racism, that's a foreign concept. Take, for instance, the liars over at the Caucasian Nazi Network. They recently ran a story that was an absolute dung heap of historical revisionism and phony comparisons. The headline, "At 91, he's one of the last surviving participants in a U.S. program some described as legalized slavery." And what, you may wonder, are they talking about? Surely they must be referencing, say, the chain gangs that existed at the turn of the 20th century. Black people who were literally being snatched off the street by unscrupulous sheriffs and police and being thrown in jail and told, you committed some crime, so you gotta work on these chain gangs for God knows how long, under the most brutal conditions. No water if you got any at all. And of course they always had the shotgun, and they would often brutalize the people just because they could. Because that was an example of slavery under the guise of law enforcement. Legalized slavery. But no, CNN's not talking about that at all. They're talking about a worker program that the government ran back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, where they brought Mexicans in to work the farms. And yet we're being told that this was slavery. Why? Because CNN says the conditions were quote-unquote grueling. And what was the proof of this inhumane treatment? What was the evidence? Well, the braceros, as they were called, when they got to one of the locations where they were supposed to be proceeding to their farms to work at, they were sprayed with insecticide and had their hands inspected to make sure that they were qualified for the hard labor they would be doing. That was the inhumane treatment. The rest of it was that they were out in the hot sun, but then again, I don't think that what they were going through was anywhere near as bad as what it was that Black people were being forced to go through on those chain gangs. But the claim that this was some sort of legalized slavery falls flat. As the story CNN wrote itself says, these men were invited by the U.S. government to come to the U.S. This was a voluntary program. The braceros were not slaves. Nobody slapped them in leg irons. Nobody forced them to get on a slave ship or a slave truck or anything else. They came to the U.S. because they wanted to. And nobody was forced to stay. They could leave at any time. And they did, including the man who this story is about. He left the United States multiple times. In fact, over the course of 11 years, this guy would bounce back and forth across the border between the U.S. and Mexico. This is the alleged slavery that the story claims was occurring, the legalized slavery of a man who had the ability to go back to Mexico anytime he wanted, and he did. And as the story itself says, he then did everything he could to stay in the U.S. and keep working. Since when does a slave do everything that they can to stay on the plantation? And he did that for 11 years, over a decade. This man came to the U.S. voluntarily of his own free will. Then he left to go back to Mexico, then volunteered to come back, then went back to Mexico, and he did that over and over again for 11 years. Now, pardon my asking, but where's the slavery that CNN was talking about? When a slave is on a plantation, they're not allowed to leave. And if they try, they get whipped or mutilated or outright killed. And another thing, slaves don't get paid. The braceros did. In fact, that was the entire reason they were in the U.S., to get paid. Slaves, real ones like our ancestors, never got paid at all. When they left the plantations, they didn't go back. Not for 11 years, not even for 11 seconds. But the braceros did, like the subject of this story. Under slavery, not only are you a slave, but so are your children. Were any of this man's children forced to have to work in those fields that he said were so horrible? Were any of his co-workers' children snatched up and forced to work the fields with him? Was anyone allowed to rape his wife with impunity? Anyone allowed to sell his children to anywhere they wanted to? Of course not. So how is this slavery? Answer, it's not. And that also goes for Japanese Americans who were put into detention camps during World War II. Were they forced to work the fields? Did anyone kill or mutilate them for trying to run away? Anyone whip them for not obeying massa? There's a huge difference between being a prisoner and a slave. And it's an insult to the suffering of people who are actually slaves when you compare voluntary laborers and people who were merely put into confinement to people who are brutally forced to go from one place to another, with many of them dying in the process, and then sold as the property of some inbreds down south. And after that, forced to work from morning till night until the day they died with no pay. The braceros got paid, and the Japanese prisoners at Manzanar didn't get forced to work at all. Nobody wrote any laws saying the braceros weren't human beings. They only did that with us. See, migrants who volunteered to pick vegetables, that's not slavery. And these phony comparisons are merely part of a never-ending propaganda war against black Americans. How dare the Caucasian Nazi network make such a claim? This is what the white media's idea of slavery is. When someone chooses of their own free will to come work in the U.S. on a dirty and unpleasant job that they knew was dirty and unpleasant from the beginning, and they're getting paid for their work, and they return over and over again, and even after all that, they liked slavery so much that they wouldn't leave. The punchlines write themselves. This wasn't slavery. Only slavery was slavery. Neither this man nor any of his co-workers were ever slaves, and they weren't victims either. Nothing happened that was not of their own free will. He wasn't forced to come to the U.S., he chose to come to the U.S., and then after that he chose to come back over and over and over again to work the exact same job. And then when the program ended in the 60s, he decided that he would stay. The entire point of the white media pushing this historical revisionism is meant to water down the oppression that we've endured by making phony claims that, well, everybody else was more or less treated the same, weren't they? Because after all, if everything is called slavery, then nothing is slavery. But CNN really outdid themselves with this one. They tied their forked tongues in knots trying to manufacture a narrative that a worker program is somehow the same as chattel slavery. And the city out there in Rio whatever is making plans to put money behind turning that processing center for these day laborers into a museum. Really? So black Americans can't get dime number one to support telling the history that we made building this country and making it possible for these guys to actually have jobs when they got here and for them to be able to get in the first place. And yet you have people who aren't even citizens, and these politicians are tripping over their shoelaces to build museums because... And the bracero that they profiled in this story, he was in the U.S. for decades as an illegal alien. And it was the Republicans, Ronald Reagan to be exact, who gave this man amnesty, him and millions of others, and allowed them to remain in the country. Now, if this was slavery that he had been subjected to, then why the hell did he stay for a decade after decade? And today this man's a citizen. He became a citizen a lot faster than the real slaves did, and he enjoyed more freedom and opportunity than black people did after chattel slavery, let alone during it. And nobody's telling him to shut up or that he needs to stop complaining or that was a long time ago. There's nothing in this CNN piece where they have anyone who tries to justify whatever alleged mistreatment happened or to say that this was just how it was back then and people need to accept it and move on. They don't do the kind of stuff that they do whenever they're talking about black people where they say, okay, now here's why these Negroes are supposed to be mistreated. Here's the justification for it, and here's why nothing should be done about it. This is part of the ongoing effort to try to manufacture reparations claims for everybody who doesn't actually have one. We've seen them do this with the LGBT community and others. A volunteer worker who knowingly asks to come to a country where they're hanging black people can't claim not to know what he was jumping into. He can't claim to think, well, you shouldn't be treating me like that. This man came back and forth across the border repeatedly. And then in the end, he deliberately broke U.S. law by remaining in the country, and he stated that for decades he was in the U.S. illegally until he got an amnesty 30 years after he'd voluntarily come here, and deliberately refused to leave. Strange behavior for someone who escaped from slavery, don't you think? But then again, this is all white media propaganda, and we know what purpose it's supposed to serve. But if CNN is truly so arrogant as to think that this false comparison of theirs is appropriate, all I gotta say to that is, they must have fallen off of one of the turnip trucks that this guy was loading vegetables onto back in the day. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Starlet Thompson, Charlie, Morris Bodden, Pharrell Taylor, and Tamara Williams. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.